Overthinking won't solve it, but you already know that. You already know overthinking won't solve it.
You've known that for a while.
But still, your mind keeps spinning, rehearsing, analyzing, dissecting every angle like the missing answer is buried under one more thought. It's not that you don't understand the situation. You do. You've gone over it more times than you'd admit out loud. You've weighed the pros and cons. You've imagined how it might unfold. You've asked others. You've asked yourself. And somehow, the longer you stay in your head, the further away you feel from any real clarity. This is the loop, a silent mental prison that doesn't feel like a trap because it's made of thought. It feels like you're doing something useful, like thinking harder will give you control. Like if you just wait long enough, certainty will arrive, and finally you'll be able to move. But what if it's the opposite? What if overthinking isn't helping you understand, it's helping you avoid? What if your brain learned to use thought as a form of self-protection? Not to bring you clarity, but to keep you safe from action, risk, responsibility, or pain. That's what this video is about. Not how to stop thinking too much, but why the mind gets stuck in the first place and how to break the loop without betraying your intelligence. This isn't about silencing your thoughts. It's about learning how to finish them. Let's start at the real beginning, not with the problem you're overthinking about, but with the habit of overthinking itself. The thought that never ends. It doesn't feel like panic. It doesn't even feel irrational. It just feels constant. You try to sleep and the thought is still running. You take a walk, it follows. You finally make progress and still, there it is. Again, like a background process that never really shuts off. The thought isn't always traumatic. Sometimes it's about what someone said, or what you should have said, or what might happen, or what already did. But the pattern is the same. The thought starts, then loops, then expands. And the more you try to solve it, the more it multiplies. This is what chronic overthinking looks like. Not deep analysis, not high-functioning intelligence, but unresolved mental noise disguised as logic. The pain isn't just in the thought itself. It's in the lack of closure. You want to finish the thought, but your brain won't give you a landing point, so you keep spinning. It feels like doing something, but it's just running in circles with your attention. The reason it feels so hard to stop isn't because you're weak. It's because your nervous system is still activated. Your mind believes something isn't safe, or resolved, or real, and so it keeps replaying the scene, hoping that thinking harder will fix what your emotions haven't fully processed yet. This isn't a flaw in your brain. It's a survival mechanism. Your mind is trying to protect you from uncertainty, and it's using thought as a defense. But here's the turning point. You don't break the loop by thinking harder. You break it by recognizing when the thought has already passed its point of usefulness. You don't owe it more airtime just because it's persistent. You owe yourself peace. The thought will come, but you don't have to follow it. You can name it, notice it, and choose not to run the loop again. Because the answer you're looking for isn't buried in one more mental replay. It's waiting on the other side of letting go. Mental exhaustion masquerading as productivity. You feel like you're making progress because your mind is constantly active. You're processing, you're evaluating. You're trying to make the right call, avoid the wrong outcome, protect yourself from regret. It feels responsible, even necessary. But deep down, you're exhausted. You're not getting any closer to clarity, but you can't stop thinking. You go through the same mental checklist again and again. What if I wait? What if I act too soon? What if I miss something? You tell yourself it's part of being thorough, but something else is happening under the surface. You're not just thinking, you're working. Not on the problem, but on managing your own anxiety about the problem. This is where overthinking gets mistaken for productivity. From the outside, it looks like you're planning, preparing, analyzing, but internally, you're trapped in a cycle of delay. The longer you stay there, the more you burn mental energy without producing anything tangible. The result? A strange combination of mental fatigue and emotional guilt. You're tired, but you feel like you haven't earned the right to rest. Why? Because nothing's been resolved. This isn't just a mindset problem, it's a neurological pattern. Dopamine, the brain's motivation chemical, doesn't only get released when we act. It also gets triggered by loops of anticipation. You get micro rewards for figuring it out, even if you're not really solving anything, so the loop feels productive. But in reality, it's draining your energy and postponing the one thing that would actually give you peace, a clear decision. Here's the truth you have to face. Thinking becomes productive only when it leads to clarity, closure, or action. If it's not moving toward any of those, it's just spinning. Let yourself question this internal habit. Is this thought helping me understand something? Or is it helping me delay something I don't want to face? Because sometimes the real decision isn't about the problem itself. It's about stepping out of the mental cycle that's disguising fear as focus. Overthinking is not a personality trait, it's a safety behavior. You might have labeled yourself an overthinker, as if it's just the way your mind is wired. Maybe people even praised you for it. You're analytical. You're thoughtful. You're detail-oriented. But here's what no one says out loud. Most overthinking doesn't come from intelligence. It comes from fear. Overthinking is not a personality trait. It's a learned coping strategy, a behavioral response designed to protect you from emotional risk. Somewhere along the line, your brain connected deep thinking with staying safe. If you thought everything through, you could avoid pain. You could stay in control. You could prevent the unpredictable. So your mind kept sharpening that tool, not because it was useful, but because it once kept you from harm. This is the trap. Over time, what starts as a survival response becomes part of your identity. You begin to believe that this is just who I am. You wear it like a badge. But the truth is, most chronic overthinkers are just people who learned, often early, that action feels unsafe. That stillness feels like danger. That risk means loss. So instead of moving, they think. Instead of choosing, they weigh. Instead of trusting, they over-prepare. This isn't about blame. It's about awareness. When you mistake a defense mechanism for a personality trait, you stop questioning it. You give it a permanent place in your life. But once you recognize it as behavior, a response, not a feature, you can change it. This shift is everything. You're not broken. You're just using the wrong strategy for the stage of life you're in now. You don't need more analysis. You need to restore your sense of safety, not in thought, but in action. Because the real you isn't the loop. The real you is the part that knows it's time to move, but hasn't trusted that it's safe to do so. Not yet. What you're really avoiding when you need more time. You tell yourself you're just being careful, that you need to think it through a little more, that the timing isn't right. But deep down, you're not waiting for more information. You're waiting to feel less afraid. This is one of the most invisible patterns in chronic overthinking. You believe you're analyzing, but you're actually avoiding. Not avoiding the problem itself, but avoiding what the problem might demand from you. A choice, a confrontation, a risk, or a shift in identity. And instead of facing that internal friction, you ask for more time. You delay. You loop. Because it feels safer to not decide than to decide and regret it. At the core of this delay is emotion, not logic. Fear of regret. Fear of failing. Fear of disappointing someone. Fear of closing one door and never finding another. That fear isn't irrational, it's human. But when you don't name it, you end up disguising emotional avoidance as strategic patience. Behavioral psychology calls this experiential avoidance. The mind's tendency to steer away from discomfort, even if it means sabotaging long-term clarity. The more uncertain the outcome feels, the more your mind convinces you that hesitation is wisdom. But that's a lie. In reality, your hesitation is just fear with better branding. Here's the shift. Every time you say, "I need more time," ask yourself what you're afraid to feel. Is it the discomfort of loss? The pressure of responsibility? The vulnerability of being seen? The answer to that question won't make the fear disappear, but it will stop it from running your mind behind the scenes. Because clarity doesn't come from waiting for fear to vanish. It comes from being honest about what you're actually postponing. And the moment you name the emotion, you reclaim your agency. Your brain likes the loop, and that's the problem. It sounds strange at first. Why would your brain want to keep you stuck in uncertainty? Why would it replay the same scenario over and over when you're already exhausted by it? But the truth is, the loop doesn't exist because it's helpful. It exists because it's familiar, and the brain rewards what feels familiar, even when it's painful. Here's how it works. Every time you revisit a thought, your brain gets a small dopamine hit. Not because you're solving anything, but because you're engaging with something that feels controllable. Thinking becomes a source of stimulation. A way to feel like you're doing something without taking real risk. So even if you're not moving forward, the mental loop gets reinforced. The pattern feels productive, and your nervous system falsely registers that as progress. This is how chronic overthinking becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. The more you loop, the more your brain gets used to the loop. And over time, not thinking actually feels more dangerous than staying stuck. Stillness starts to feel unsafe, not because of logic, but because your mind has learned that activity equals security. But just because a habit is neurologically rewarding doesn't mean it's useful. Dopamine doesn't equal clarity. It equals engagement. And what you're engaging with matters. Are you moving toward resolution, or are you just stimulating your brain to avoid the discomfort of action? The shift begins when you stop asking, "Why can't I stop thinking about this?" and start asking, "What is this thought giving me that I'm afraid to lose?" Maybe it gives you a sense of control. Maybe it gives you temporary relief. Maybe it helps you avoid the fear of being wrong. But once you name the payoff, the loop starts to lose its grip. Because the thought might feel familiar, but that doesn't mean it's the truth. And it definitely doesn't mean it deserves your energy. Why certainty won't save you? You keep waiting for the moment you'll feel completely sure. Certain enough to act. Clear enough to speak. Confident enough to decide without looking back, but that moment keeps moving. The more you think, the further it gets. This is the hidden trap. You've made certainty a condition for action. You've told yourself that once you're 100% sure, then you'll do it. Then you'll move forward. But here's the problem. Certainty isn't a place you arrive at. It's a feeling your brain generates after you act. It's not a prerequisite. It's a byproduct. The belief that certainty will one day just show up is comforting, but it's false. Certainty, as a psychological state, often follows momentum. It grows when you start doing the thing, not when you sit around thinking about it. Action generates feedback. Feedback builds confidence. Confidence stabilizes perception. That's the sequence. But overthinking reverses the order. It demands confidence before movement, clarity before exposure. This isn't how real life works. The discomfort you're trying to avoid is baked into the process of growth. Neuroscience tells us that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, operates under uncertainty all the time. It's not designed to eliminate risk. It's designed to tolerate it. Certainty isn't its goal, direction is. The longer you chase absolute certainty, the longer you postpone your own life. Not because you're lazy, not because you lack discipline, but because you're running from the emotional tension of committing to a path when the outcome isn't guaranteed. Here's the insight that breaks the cycle. You don't need to feel ready to move. You just need to stop waiting for a version of clarity that doesn't exist. Because the real question isn't, am I sure enough to act? The real question is, can I trust myself to face whatever happens after I do? The myth of the perfect decision. You keep hoping the right answer will feel clean, obvious, undeniable. You want a decision so perfect that it eliminates risk, silences doubt, and leaves no space for regret. But that kind of decision doesn't exist, and the longer you wait for it, the more control you give to fear. This is the perfectionist distortion of overthinking. It's not about making the best decision. It's about avoiding the emotional discomfort of making a flawed one. You convince yourself that you're being wise when in reality, you're just terrified of consequences. So you stall, you analyze, you revisit. You create the illusion of precision to avoid facing what's fundamentally unpredictable. But decisions aren't moral tests. They're not right or wrong in advance. They're contextual bets based on the information and self-awareness you have right now. Expecting a choice to be perfect is like expecting a map to predict the weather. It can guide you, but it can't control what happens next. Psychologist Albert Ellis called this demandingness, the irrational belief that life should offer guarantees before we act, that we must get it right or we failed, that any mistake is proof we're incapable. But life doesn't work that way. And neither does growth. What you really need is a decision that reflects your values, not your fear. One that moves you in a direction you can adapt from, not one you think will solve everything. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is movement with integrity. Because waiting for a perfect decision isn't just a delay tactic. It's a way of saying you don't believe you can handle what happens next. And the moment you stop chasing flawless outcomes, you start building real self-trust. You're not supposed to know everything before you begin. You're supposed to know yourself well enough to begin anyway. Thought without closure is emotional avoidance. There's a kind of thinking that feels productive, sharp, logical, focused. And then there's the kind that drifts, repeats, spirals. You start with a thought, but it doesn't land. It just floats. You revisit it, reword it, reframe it, but it never ends in resolution. That's not thinking anymore. That's escape. When you find yourself trapped in mental loops with no closure, you're no longer thinking through the issue. You're using thought to avoid emotion. You're avoiding the discomfort of disappointment, the sting of uncertainty, the vulnerability of being wrong, or the shame of not knowing what to do next. This is why your thoughts keep returning. Not because there's more to figure out, but because you've left something unfelt. Unprocessed emotion hides beneath the surface, and instead of facing it, your mind performs a kind of intellectual gymnastics. It feels like analysis, but it's actually emotional avoidance in cognitive clothing. Neuroscience shows us that the brain doesn't separate thought and emotion as cleanly as we imagine. According to Antonio Damasio's research, decision-making is deeply intertwined with emotional processing. When emotional circuits are bypassed or suppressed, people lose the ability to make clear decisions, even when their reasoning skills remain intact. In other words, emotion isn't the enemy of logic. It's a precondition for clarity. If you're stuck in overthinking, ask, what feeling am I avoiding by staying in my head? Sometimes it's grief. Sometimes it's guilt. Sometimes it's just fear of being visible, exposed, or wrong. But whatever it is, until you let yourself face that discomfort, your thoughts will keep circling back, pretending to help, while silently protecting you from truth. Here's what sets you free. Your mind doesn't need more time to think. It needs permission to feel what it's been trying to outrun. Because closure doesn't come from the perfect thought. It comes from the courage to stop thinking long enough to feel what's actually there. How to know when you've thought enough. It's hard to tell the difference between useful reflection and mental rumination when you're inside it. You tell yourself you're just being thorough, that you're still working through it. But at some point, thinking stops being helpful and starts being harm disguised as effort. So how do you know when you've crossed that line? The answer isn't in how long you've thought. It's in what your thinking is doing. Productive thought leads to something: insight, action, clarity, direction. Even if it's uncomfortable, it creates movement. Rumination, on the other hand, keeps you circling the same emotional weight without resolution. You're not solving. You're recycling. There are signs. When you're repeating the same logic with no new outcome, when you're mentally rehearsing conversations that already happened, when you're asking questions you can't answer, you're looping. When your energy drops the longer you think about it, or your mood shifts from uncertain to depleted, you've thought past the point of usefulness. Attention science tells us that the brain is wired for pattern detection, but it burns out when forced to reprocess the same stimulus with no closure. That mental fatigue you're feeling isn't a signal to think harder. It's a sign that you've stayed too long in the wrong mode. Here's the shift. You don't need to stop thinking altogether. You need to set boundaries with your mind. If a thought hasn't produced a new insight after the 5th time you've revisited it, it's probably not insight you need. It's permission. Permission to stop trying to think your way out of an emotion. Permission to move forward without full certainty. Permission to decide without feeling completely ready. And once you know how to spot the moment when thought turns into avoidance, you can intervene. You can break the loop. Not by resisting thought, but by choosing when to stop feeding it. Because you don't owe every thought your attention, only the ones that move you closer to clarity. Interrupting the loop. Small actions that break mental paralysis. By now, you've seen the pattern. Overthinking thrives in inaction. The longer you stay in your head, the harder it becomes to move. But the solution isn't forcing yourself to make a giant decision. The solution is interrupting the loop with small, grounded actions that shift your mental state and return you to clarity. Mental paralysis isn't about a lack of intelligence. It's about momentum, or the lack of it. When your brain is stuck in analysis mode, your nervous system stays on alert, scanning for threats that don't exist yet. You can't think your way out of that state. You have to interrupt it behaviorally. This doesn't mean rushing into decisions. It means creating friction between thought and action, inserting physical or cognitive micro-movements that short-circuit the loop and give your brain something to anchor to. It could be as simple as standing up, changing rooms, or writing the thought down on paper instead of letting it spin in your head. It could be giving yourself 5 minutes to make a low-stakes version of the decision. Not the whole commitment, just the first signal. It could mean speaking the thought out loud and hearing how much of it actually holds up when said in plain language. Behavioral psychology backs this up. Action, even symbolic action, reduces cognitive load. Once you shift from passive thought to embodied movement, your brain starts reorienting itself toward resolution. The loop loses power when your body and your mind are no longer working in isolation. The mistake most people make is trying to think their way to readiness. But readiness isn't a thought. It's a signal from your nervous system that you've re-entered agency. And that starts with one simple question. What's the smallest meaningful action I can take right now that moves me 1 inch out of my head and 1 inch back into life? That inch might be all it takes to break the loop. Overthinking doesn't protect you. It delays your life. You keep telling yourself that staying in your head keeps you safe. That if you just wait a little longer, gather more information, weigh one more angle, you'll avoid the mistake. You'll dodge the regret. You'll stay in control. But look closely at what it's costing you. Every loop you stay in is a moment not lived. Every decision you postpone is an experience you never have. Every risk you avoid is a version of yourself you never meet. Overthinking doesn't keep you from harm. It keeps you from becoming. The tragedy of mental paralysis is that it doesn't look like failure. It looks like waiting, like preparation, like thoughtfulness, and in that disguise, it steals time. Not all at once, but quietly. A conversation you didn't start. A move you didn't make. A chance you let expire because the timing didn't feel perfect. This isn't about shaming you into action. It's about waking you up to a deeper truth. Your mind is trying to protect your safety, but it's sacrificing your aliveness to do it. Living with clarity doesn't mean you'll never make mistakes. It means you won't spend your life sitting at the edge of decisions, pretending the view is enough. You already know what it's like to live in loops. You know the toll. You feel the energy drain, the lowered self-trust, the subtle guilt of having delayed too long again. Now ask yourself, if this loop wasn't here, what would I already be doing? Because the answer to that question is the real you, not the version trying to be perfect. Not the version addicted to certainty. The one who knows that fear is inevitable and still wants to live. And the longer you wait to meet that version, the further away it gets. You don't need more time. You need to trust your mind. You've thought about it from every angle. You've replayed the details, imagined the outcomes, tried to predict the consequences. And still, you hesitate because some part of you believes that just a little more time will make it easier. That one more thought will make it safer. That the fear will shrink if you wait long enough. But it doesn't shrink. It just settles deeper. And the more time you give it, the more power it holds. What you're waiting for isn't time. What you're really waiting for is permission. Permission to trust that you've thought enough. That you don't need to earn your next move with more mental labor. That your capacity to choose is already intact, even if you don't feel completely certain. The problem has never been your thinking. It's been the way you distrust your ability to move without perfect clarity. That's not humility. That's fear posing as caution. Here's the turning point. You don't need to be more ready. You need to remember that you already are. You've gathered enough information. You've felt enough tension. You've looped long enough to know this isn't about knowledge. It's about courage, not reckless courage. Informed courage, rational courage. The kind that comes from self-respect, not impulse. You will make decisions that don't go as planned. That's life. But that's not the risk. The real risk is never knowing what would have happened if you'd finally acted on what you already knew deep down. So here's the final truth. You don't need more time to think. You need to start trusting the version of you that already knows it's time to move. Because the only thing overthinking ever protected you from was your own growth.